The React 19 beta is finally here. Of course, we have to talk about it. It's been a wild journey here from when a lot of these features were announced all the way back at NextConf in 2022. But I'm so excited to finally get to share these things, play with them in other frameworks and applications, and be able to call these features stable. Because up until now, we've been using a canary version, which is a little bit sketchy. But with this beta, things have changed. We got to go over this release. This is an important note at the top here. This beta release is for libraries to prepare for React 19. So if you're an application developer, this isn't for you. React 19 will make it to your apps very soon, but the goal of this release isn't to get everyone using React 19. It's to specifically help library developers, framework authors, those types of nerds like myself even, get to experience these things early. That doesn't mean we can't go over the new things in this release, but just an important note. They even say here that app developers should upgrade to 18.3 and wait for React 19 stable as we work with libraries and make changes based on feedback. What's new in React 19? First off, we have actions. A common use case in React apps is to perform a data mutation and then update state in the response. For example, when a user submits a form to change their name, you'll make an API request and then handle the response. In the past, you would need to handle pending states, errors, optimistic updates, and sequential requests manually. Here's a traditional before actions example. We have the use state for the name, the error, the pending, and we have the handle submit function that sets pending to true. We have the error case. Once we've handled that, we set pending to false, and if there's an error, we set the error to true as well. And the usual input button, you get the idea here. But in React 19, we're adding support for using async functions and transitions to handle pending states, errors, forms, and optimistic updates automatically. I will admit, whenever I hear the word automatically, especially around forms, I get a little bit skeptical, but I'm optimistic about what they're doing here. Optimistic is a bit of a pun, can't help myself. For example, you can use transition to handle the pending state for you. So here we have the set name, error, and the start transition is pending function here. This transition hook is very handy because you can set this use transition hook is very handy because you can set this transitional state when something is going on. So in this case, when we're doing this push to a server, we can start a transition, do this update here, set the error if we have it, do the redirect there. And instead of these stateful updates coming through one at a time, like they would above here, we would set pending to true, we'd handle the error, or we'd do the call, then we set pending to false. So there's technically a point here where pending is false, but we don't have the error if there is an error. Usually React batches these things well enough to handle it, but if you had additional async stuff here, that doesn't work. With use transition, the start transition content, whatever you have wrapped here, will not trigger a state update until all of it is complete, which is really handy. So if you do 3 state updates in here, they'll all come through as one update at the end. Really nice. The async transition will immediately set the isPending state to true, make the async requests, and then switch isPending to false after any transitions. This allows you to keep the current UI responsive and interactive while the data is changing. That's another good point too. When you have this all going on in a transition like this, you can handle whatever else you want, wherever else in the app you want to, and not have to worry about it as much. Important note here too. By convention, functions that use async transitions are called actions. Actions automatically manage submitting data for you by having things like pending state, where actions provide a pending state that starts at the beginning of a request and automatically resets when the final state update is committed. Very, very handy to have a proper pending state before and after things without having to write a bunch of additional code for it. The amount of code you have to write just to do a fetch call properly in React has always been a bit memey because it's so obnoxious. And now that kind of stuff is just handled. Also, optimistic updates. I'll admit I haven't been pumped with the use optimistic workflows, but I'm excited to see if they've improved it all here, and also haven't really used them enough to have them click, so maybe it's a skill issue and I'll end up liking it more in the future. But at this point in time, I have found use optimistic to still be a little clunky. That said, every optimistic update pattern I've seen has been relatively clunky, so it's not unique to this. But as they say here, actions support the new use optimistic hook, so you can show users instant feedback while the requests are submitting. Also includes error handling, as well as working well with forms directly, which is nice because up until now, React hasn't really acknowledged forms. They've just kind of been a pain point for all of us React devs. Let's take a look at actual action code now. Building on top of actions, we're also introducing form actions to manage forms automatically. Use optimistic to manage optimistic updates, and the new hooks use action state and use form status to support the common cases for actions and forms. Or here's a simple example using actions instead. We have the use action state, which has error, submit action is pending. You pass it the action code, so this is the stuff that you actually want to do when the submit happens. And now we have the form with the action is submit action, the input, the button for submitting, the error being shown in the form directly. And now here we have async previous state form data. So you actually have the previous state if you need that for some reason. We run the update. The one annoying piece here is that form data is being used for everything. And as you guys know, I'm a type safety nut. There's no way here to know for sure that the input type text is actually going to give you text here, which means there's room for somebody to make a custom version of use action state that has like a validator such as odd in the middle there to make sure you're validating and getting the types that you actually expect. I could even see a library that does the JSX part too, where under the hood, it's doing exactly what we see here, but at the very least, it provides you like type safety and consistency guarantees that aren't provided by the code I'm seeing here. That said, generally speaking, making things simpler is the best win for scalability, because if you can make this code really simple, the likelihood that there's an error that sneaks through in code review is way lower. And relying on type systems in order to allow complexity to exist is great, but if the complexity doesn't need to exist, you should go as simple as you can. Still skeptical, because I would love for this to be signed in a type-safe way where different inputs are handled properly, and I've never loved the formData.get method for getting information. That said, this code is objectively way simpler and more reliable. I like this direction. Also of note, though, is that this form, it has the action bound directly to this hook. So that's an interesting relationship change that hasn't really existed in React before. The idea of a hook that returns something that's only really built to be used within a specific element type, in this case, a form. It's interesting. I have feelings. I'm leaning positive, and mostly because I've been using form actions inside of Next.js with server actions for a bit now. I have confidence this will work out, but it is very different from what I'm used to. In the next section, we'll break down each of the new action features within React 19, including use action state. I've seen some controversy around this one. Let's see how I feel after reading this. Something that I've always been iffy about with React is its love of returning these arrays rather than an object with named keys. The benefit of doing it this way is that you can name these whatever you want. So if you have like 3 use action state hooks, you could have like error form 1, error form 2, error form 3 without having to write a bunch of additional code. But if I guess I'm pulling up my editor to show what I mean here.
A few moments later.
I had to spend a good bit of time setting up a test repo to play with this stuff. This is not the easiest beta to consume because the types aren't included, since you have to get types from @type/react, but that package isn't up to date. You have to install these custom versions of npm types react at alpha and then do an override here. Not the most fun thing. Thankfully, they documented it well enough if you really want to try things, which I did, so we got it working. So we have to rely on this array being the correct order, because error has to go first, the submit, or what they call here submit action, has to be second, and then the third thing is pending has to be third. You can name these whatever you want, which is useful if you have a bunch of these hooks. My issue is that you have to remember the order of these things. For example, if you got these out of order like that, this is something very subtle that would pass code review that is entirely broken, and avoiding mistakes like that is annoying. It also makes things like type safety a little more annoying too. My ideal here would be something with an object. So instead of returning like this, we would have error submit action and is pending. And if you actually wanted different names for these, you can do that. Like error, first, error, submit action, first, submit, etc. I'm getting type errors here because this isn't actually how it works, but if you wanted to give these things custom names, you still can with the object. It's more verbose, but it would be nice. Generally, React has leaned away from using objects. There's a lot of reasons why. I think this customizability is one of them, but it is always a little frustrating, especially now that we have these named steps within what's being returned, and we're expected to do those in the right order. They also expect you to pass 2 to 3 things to use action state. Let's take a look at the type def. Yeah, we have the action. You also pass it the initial state, which isn't optional, even though in all of the examples here, it's not passed, which is very strange that in the examples, use action state doesn't have a default, but in their type definition, it actually requires it as the second argument. Interesting. I have feelings. This is still clearly a little early, but I would have expected that to not require the initial state, and I'm a little surprised it does. I do like the idea of a hook that is a primitive that does a lot of these types of things. There's a lot of this type of stuff that I've wished React included for a while, including a use memo with callback, which would be a life changer for me. I've complained about this forever. But this is specifically for actions, especially in forms. I see the potential. I just wish they named these keys and gave me an object instead. Something like React Query does this really well. Here's an example of React Query where we have status, data, and error, which are all things returned by use query. It makes it really easy to select the things you want. Like let's say we don't actually care about the error state here, but we do obviously need the submit and is pending. You have to do an underscore for that and know the order of these things. I don't love that pattern. I wish React would start moving away from it. It wouldn't be as elegant as we expect from React, but I think it would be better. Anyways, let's keep digging into this hook. Use action state accepts a function, which is the action, and it returns a wrapped action to call. This works because actions compose. When the wrapped action is called, use action state will return the last result of the action as data, and the pending state of the action is pending. This is actually a really nice part too I hadn't thought about before. It's pretty easy to build something like this in React, but if one of your submissions takes longer than the other one, like let's say you submit once, it takes a while to resolve, then you submit a second time and it takes less time. If you didn't set things up correctly, the first one, since it came back later, ends up overriding the second one, even though you did the second action second, which is super unintuitive to be typing away, hitting submit, changing your mind, hit submit again, and then it updates to the old state because it got the first update back later. Weirdly common mistake a lot of applications have, especially those using React and rolling their own stuff here. This is why I've always used React Query. Having it built in is really nice. Note, React.useActionState was previously called useFormState in the Canary releases, but we've renamed it and deprecated useFormState. Good call, because there's uses for this that aren't just forms. Although, again, on the note of React Query, I am sorry, Tanner, and TanStack Query and TKDodo. It seems like React is now challenging you directly. Where is the mutations? Here we are. Mutations, as you can even see from here, are very similar. The big difference being you have to pass an object with a mutation function key, which again, you guys know where my preference is here. It has the is pending, is error, is success, all of the stuff that we're used to getting from what we just saw there. What we don't have with TanStack Query is this deep integration with forms, though. In fact, doing this without being React yourself would be a bit hard. You'd have to make your own component library as well. Actions are also integrated with React 19's new form features. We've added support for passing functions as the action and form action props of form, input, and button elements, automatically submitting forms with actions. Cool. It's interesting that they're leaning into this idea of like letting the form primitive do its thing. But seeing this more and more, I still think forms are cursed, but it's cool that they're getting slightly less cursed over time. When a form action succeeds, React will automatically reset the form for uncontrolled components. If you need to reset the form manually, you can call the new request form reset React DOM API. Interesting. Very interesting. For more information, see the docs for all of these components. Interesting that there's now docs for form, input, and button in the React docs. What do these even look like? Canary. React's extension to form are currently only available. Now they're calling it extensions to form. That is what it is. The built-in browser form component lets you create interactive controls for submitting information. Anyways, let's take a look at use form status, because this one confused me a lot during the React and Next.js early stuff. In design systems, it's common to write design components that need access to information about the form that they're in without drilling props down to the component. This can be done via context, but to make the common case easier, we've added a new hook, use form status. This is a good description of it. Imagine you have a fancy button that your designers gave you from your design system, and you want to use that as the submit button instead. You shouldn't have to pass all of the props down to that button for every single possible condition. Ideally, anything it needs from the form is accessible directly, which it is here with this new use form status hook. You just have this hook inside of the button component, and you no longer need to pass props down. It's able to tell by being a child of a given form that that's what this is linked to. It's weird because it's an implicit behavior rather than explicitly passing the properties down, but forms are full of weird implicit bullshit, so I think it aligns with that. Use form status reads the status from the parent form as if the form was a context provider. I really like this description, actually. It's been hard to summarize what this hook does. This is a super concise, it's one of those like Dan Abramov descriptions that took months to think of to get just right, but they nailed it with that one. It treats the form like a context provider. Whew, clean. Use optimistic. Let's see if they can help me understand this one, because it's been hard to work with historically. Another common UI pattern when performing a data mutation is to show the final state optimistically while the async request is underway. In React 19, we're adding a new hook called use optimistic to make this easier. In case you weren't familiar with optimistic updates, the idea is that you show the user what things would look like when it's done while it's going on so that the app feels more responsive. Really nice, especially for people with like bad connections or services that take a long time to resolve. It's good to feel like the thing worked when you're doing it rather than having to wait and see later on, have the whole app freeze in the interim. So here we have optimistic name, set optimistic name using this hook. So for rendering the name on the top here, your name is whatever. but we're waiting for this form like update to pass before we update it. It'll take a long time to actually see that. But with the optimistic change here, instead, if we're using this instead of a traditional use state, we can get that early. I think the big difference here is that with something like a transition, a lot of this gets opted out of. So if you did like a one-off set state inside of a transition, it won't update because that's the whole point of transitions. But if you wanted this to update, calling use optimistics set instead of a use state set will actually force the update early. Let me know, React team, if I'm wrong about that, but it seems like that's the goal of this hook, is to opt out of the transition stuff, because the action stuff, as well as just calling use transition directly, results in these state updates being batched. But we don't want to wait until the update is complete to see the result. So use optimistic just gives us an early escape. Yeah. The use optimistic hook will immediately render the optimistic name while the update name request is still in progress. When the update finishes or errors, React will automatically switch back to the current name value. Where is current name even? I didn't even notice this little key. Very important piece, that whatever you're passing here is the value that it's returning. And if you ever want to temporarily update it, set optimistic helps with that. Okay, this is starting to click for me more now. I see the value. It is weird having a value that you get from somewhere else and wrapping it with this hook just to allow temporary updates. But I also like the idea that when this is called within a transition, it gets set back to whatever the value it passed, or you pass to it afterwards. Interesting. It's like a use temporary state with early change type hook, where this will only be changed during the transition and it will be changed during the transition. Makes sense. It's like a weird pile of hacks on top of use state to get through some of these rougher transitional type things. They have a whole doc about that if you want. Oh boy, another hook that I've had a lot of trouble using. Use. I have yet to get this one working in a code base in a way that actually made sense to me. Let's see what they have to say. In React 19, we're introducing a new API to read resources in render. Use. In render is a key piece here. For example, you can read a promise with use, and React will suspend until the promise resolves. So here we have import use from React, function comments. We have this we have this async function that gets us the comments. Then we return comments.map, where we actually wrap all of these in a paragraph. I will say this should technically have some wrapper around it, because you can only return one element, and this would return an array. So this isn't technically a component, funny enough, but it's a good example regardless. But there's a comment here that's important. This will resume the promise from the server. It will suspend until the data is available. This is an important note though. Use does not support promises created in render. If you try to pass a promise created in render to use, React will warn as such. A component was suspended by an uncached promise. Creating promises inside a client component or hook is not yet supported, except via suspense compatibility libraries or frameworks. To fix this, you'll need to pass a promise from a suspense-powered library or framework that supports caching for promises. In the future, we plan to ship features to make it easier to cache promises in render. Seeing why this hook's a little bit weird. You can also read from a context with use. Honestly, I think this is going to be the best use case, because you can use the use hook regardless of if it's in a condition or not. If you're used to writing React, this code might be giving you a heart attack right now because you're used to hooks being a thing that you have to call outside of if statements so that React can do its crazy optimizations. Now you don't have to. Now you can just call this use hook directly and it should just work. Pretty nice. And it's the best way to access context. No more context consumers. Just call use, wrap it, or pass it the context, and you have what you're looking for. Small typo here. This dark theme context comes from theme context. This one comes from light theme context. If they had just passed both from theme context and give an object, you know my complaints already. Regardless, did they not go more in depth on this? Because I have feelings. I have a lot of feelings. The key here is that we have to handle suspense somehow, and this does not showcase what that looks like. In order for this to work, comments has to be called inside of a component that has a suspense boundary and ideally also has an error boundary, so that when comments is pending, you can show the pending state. And when comments is done, you can show the complete state or an error if it failed. So you have to wrap whatever this is being called by inside of a suspense boundary. I'm assuming the reason you can't pass promises is because these promises are all being resolved outside of the component. And once they are resolved, it lets the component do the render. That's the only reason I can think of that restriction. It's an interesting one to say the least. Anyways, that's enough about all the hooks. We're going to dig into my favorite part, server components. You guys know how I feel. I was skeptical initially and I became one of the biggest proponents. I love what React is doing with server components. It's really cool stuff. Let's break down why. Server components are a new option that allow rendering components ahead of time, before bundling, in an environment separate from your client application or SSR server. The separate environment is the server in React Server Components. Server components can run once at build time on your CI server, or they can be run for each request using a web server. I like this description a lot. It's an important piece to know. React is effectively with server components, allowing you to decide when the HTML file gets created. It can be created at build, it can be created on runtime, it can be created on your server. You have a lot of options, which you didn't have before, which is really cool. It's almost like a template that is dynamically created based on your specific wants and needs, depending on if you want to run it on a server, you want to run it on build, or you don't want to run it at all. Really cool stuff. I've been enjoying it a lot. Obviously, I'm leaning heavily into the server side where things are dynamic, but you could also use this to build something static, like an old Gatsby blog. This tech is really cool for those types of things. React 19 includes all of the React Server Component features included from the Canary channel. This means libraries that ship with server components can now target React 19 as a peer dep with React Server export conditions for use in frameworks that support the full stack React architecture. So how do we build support for server components? Bundler and framework support for RSCs can be built on React 19, but the underlying APIs will not follow Semver and may break between minors in React 19.x. To support React Server Components, we recommend pinning to a specific React version or using the Canary releases. We will continue working with bundlers and frameworks to stabilize support for React Server Components in future versions. I like that they're calling out that they don't follow Semver and breaks will happen, because historically React hasn't really broken for people. Like, you can use a React component from 10 years ago in a React application today and it works just fine. Happy they're calling that out because it is an important detail. Server actions. Server actions allow client components to call async functions executed on the server. When a server action is defined with the useServer directive, your framework will automatically create references to that server function and pass the reference to the client components. When that function is called out on the client, React will send a request to the server to execute the function and return the result. Since I'm sure a lot of people who aren't normally keeping up with this stuff are watching this video, because it's like an overview of this new version, I want to call out that useServer doesn't do what many of you think it does. useServer isn't the thing you put on top of a server component. useServer creates a binding between the server and the client. When you put useClient at the top of a file, it effectively tells React, hey, make sure the JavaScript here gets sent to the client so they can use it. It's creating a tunnel from the server to send stuff to the client. When you call useServer, it does the same thing, but the other direction. It's creating a tunnel on the server for the client to send things to it. So if you wanted to submit data with a form like we were doing before, useServer is what you would use in order to let the server accept that information from the client. JavaScript goes down with useClient, JSON goes up with useServer. Hopefully that helps clear it up. Another note here, literally what I'm saying here, there is no directive for server components. A common misunderstanding is that server components are denoted by useServer, but there is no directive for server components. The useServer directive is used for server actions. I still think this should have been useAction. It actually was back in the day. I found some old commits that showcased that. They changed it to useServer because they felt like it mirrored useClient better, but by doing that, they made even more confusion, so I have feelings. Server actions can be created in server components and passed as props to client components, or they can be imported and used in client components. Love this. These behaviors are relatively different, but it's so cool that it supports both. You can pass a server component, or a server component can define an action with the useServer call, pass that down to a client component as a prop, or just embed it in a form, or you can have a folder that has a bunch of useServer server actions and then just import those in client components directly. The fact that this one primitive supports all of these use cases is really, really cool, and I haven't seen anything like it before. It's like the best parts of Remix and the best parts of TRPC is a bundler step. Whew, great stuff. Improvements in React 19. The first is ref as a prop. RIP forward ref, you will not be missed. Now, ref is the first ever default prop in React components. Okay, I guess children kind of counts. But now this key ref just exists in React. Previously, you'd have to wrap things with forward ref to tell React to treat this key differently. But rather than doing that, ref is now a reserved special prop that will handle all of these behaviors for you. So overdue. I am so thankful this finally happened. Note, refs passed to classes are not passed as props since they reference the component instance. Interesting. Didn't think about class components here because I don't really think about class components a whole lot, I'll be honest. Diffs for... Whew! I have to screenshot and tweet this. Anyways, you get the idea. We now log a single message with a diff on the mismatch. Super spicy take. As soon as hydration existed, this should have existed too. The fact that there was a concept of HTML that React hydrates and binds things to, and that can fail, that is the point at which we should have had these types of errors. We shouldn't have waited years later like we did. It's annoying. I'm thankful we have it, but these are the types of things I think give React a lot of the bad rap it has. Stuff like this, stuff like the lack of good debugging and dev tools for the server-side React stuff now, like Next.js not having good tools. Like in the browser, we can get away with it because we can just open up the dev tools. But on the server, we don't have a dev tools equivalent, and not providing us something to meet our existing expectations as web developers has caused a lot of the frustration that we're seeing today. This is another one of those examples where like the existing dev tools don't help us fix this problem, which is why people were so frustrated. So thankfully, they're now bridging that gap. Context as a provider. Oh boy. React 19, you can render context as a provider instead of context. Oh no, this is super simple. Again, they're simplifying context because use makes consuming the context significantly easier. Just a nice cleanup change. Speaking of cleanup functions for refs. Oh, I've needed this for so long. Oh. If I call use ref, will this still work? If I call use ref, will this still work? Oh, it only works when the elements are removed from the DOM, so I don't think so, actually. Okay, when the component unmounts, React will call the cleanup functions returned from the ref callback. This works for DOM refs, refs to class components, and the use imperative handle. Previously, React would call ref functions with null when unmounting the component. If your ref returns a cleanup function, React will now skip this step. In future versions, we will deprecate calling refs with null when unmounting components. Good change. Overdue. Due to the introduction of ref cleanup functions, returning anything else from a ref callback will now be rejected by TypeScript. The fix is usually to stop using implicit returns. For example, previously, if you had this wrapped in parens, it would have failed. Just wrap it in an object, it's no longer implicit, you're fine. Makes sense. The original code returned the instance of the HTML div element, and TypeScript wouldn't know. Yeah, you get the idea. Oh, you can code mod this pattern with no implicit ref callback return. I'm going to go on a little more rant here. If this is the type of change that's considered breaking in React, you should hopefully understand how little there are breaking changes in React. They even provided a code mod. Like, React doesn't break. The fact that people are so concerned about all these React changes and they don't realize all their old React code is going to run fine, it's annoying. The amount of effort they put in to make sure these things don't break is absurd. And even if this happens to be a thing you're doing wrong all over your code base, you can just code mod it out. This is the biggest breaking change we've seen so far, and it's not particularly bad. Let's be real. Use deferred value, initial value. We've added an initial value option to use deferred value. Nice. So deferred value can now be passed an initial. Let's see what they have to say about that. When initial value is provided, use deferred value will return it as the value for the initial render of the component and schedule a re-render in the background while the deferred value is returned. One example of how you would use this is if you want to show stale content while the fresh content is still loading. So if we want to show the current value and wait for an update to happen, do they have an example here? Okay, here we are. So we have this deferred query, and we can wrap this in a suspense. And now when a change occurs, we can suspend while we wait for that change to come through. Super simple, really handy. The query will update immediately, so the input will display the new value. However, the deferred query will keep its previous value until the data has loaded. So search results will show the stale results for a bit. Really nice. Back here, because they added support for document metadata. I can't believe this is another one of those things I just can't believe it wasn't in React before. Pumped that is here now. In HTML, document metadata tags like title, link, and meta are reserved for placement in the head section of the document. In React, the component that decides what metadata is appropriate for the app may be very far from the place where you render the head, or React does not render the head at all. In the past, these elements would need to be inserted manually in an effect or by libraries like React Helmet, and they also required careful handling while server rendering in a React application. Yeah, handling like the title tags and all of that type of stuff has been annoying for a while. Happy that this is now baked in primitive. You can just call title and it should theoretically hoist it to the right place. When React renders this component, it will see the title, link, and meta tags and automatically hoist them to the head section of the document. Finally. Now this will ensure that it works with client-only, streaming SSR, as well as server components. Whew, finally. They did call out that you may still want a metadata library, though, if you want to do things that are across your application using a library to generate titles, all that type of stuff. Might still make sense to use it like that, but for a lot of cases, just calling these elements is really nice. Oh, style sheets. Didn't think about that as part of the link stuff. Very interesting. For those who aren't already aware, React has never given a shit about styles. It's just not been React's thing. That's been for us to figure out as the developers building with React. Now they care. Let's see what they have to say here, because I'm not familiar with this bit. Style sheets, both externally linked via the link tag or inlined with a style tag, require careful positioning in the DOM due to style precedence rules. In case you're not already familiar, if you have two different style sheets or style tags in the same application, and you have them both update the same class name, whichever loads last is the one that will be the top. So if you have class A with background blue, and you have another style tag with class A background red, that one takes precedent. And this gets way crazier if you have A is blue, B is red, and then you apply B then A to your class names. Since B came last in the styles, it doesn't matter you put it first in the class name, it just gets overridden. So the order of your CSS and your styles is annoyingly important. So making sure they honor that is important too. Building a style sheet capability that allows for composability within components is hard. So users often end up either loading all of their styles far from their components that may depend on them, or they just use a style library which encapsulates this complexity. Or we just use Tailwind. Anyways, in React 19, we're addressing this complexity and providing even deeper integrations into concurrent rendering on the client and streaming rendering on the server, with built-in support for style sheets. If you tell React the precedence of your style sheet, it will manage the insertion order of the style sheet in the DOM and ensure that the styles, if external, are loaded before revealing content that depends on them. That is really cool. Here we have a suspense that wraps these style tags, and it won't render your article until these styles have loaded. That is super handy to not have flash of like unstyled content. Unstyled content flashing is the worst, and this just solves it. That's so cool. I did not know about this change. Yeah, during SSR, React will include the style sheet in the head, which ensures the browser will not paint until it's loaded. If the style sheet is discovered late after we've already started streaming, React will ensure the style sheet is inserted into the head on the client before revealing the content of a suspense boundary that depends on it. So if all of this content gets streamed in later, it will block the result until it's added in these link tags and then loaded the data. Whew, chef's kiss. And then during client-side rendering, React will wait for newly rendered style sheets to load before committing them to the render. If you render this component from multiple places within your app, React will only include the style sheet once in the document. Whew, I love these deduplication things too. For users accustomed to loading style sheets manually, this is an opportunity to locate those style sheets alongside the components that depend on them, allowing for better local reasoning and an easier time ensuring you only load the style sheets that you actually depend on. I can promise you that at a company like Twitch, which I only know because I worked there, at least half the styles on the site probably aren't being used anymore because we didn't have a deterministic link between a component and the styles it needed. So we just dumped styles everywhere in our CSS, and now they just sit there. So nice to see this changed. Style libraries and style integrations with bundlers can also adopt this new capability. So even if you don't directly render your own style sheets, you can still benefit as your tools are upgraded to use this feature. I'm excited to see how different libraries like Stylex could take a ton of use of this. I'm sure lots of others will too. Support for async scripts. The amount of hacks I've done to make this work in Next is absurd. Let's see how they're handling it. In HTML, normal scripts, like just a script source tag, and deferred scripts, like defer, are loaded in document order, which makes rendering these kinds of scripts deep within your component tree challenging. Async scripts, however, will load in arbitrary order, even worse. In React 19, we've included better support for async scripts by allowing you to render them anywhere in your component tree, inside the components that actually depend on the script, without having to manage relocating and deduplicating script instances. This is so useful for something like a player for media. If you're not familiar with how hard it is to stream video, take a look at HLS.js. It's massive and it's obnoxious. If you have a video component that you only want to have render and you only want to load that JS when the user is actually playing a video, now you can just dump that script tag into your video player and it will load the HLS.js pile of shit once you're mounting the component and not until then. No longer wrapping things with React that lazy, importing libraries and hoping your bundler figures it all out. Just mount a script tag. This is great. In all rendering environments, async scripts will be deduplicated so that React will only load and execute the script once, even if it is rendered by multiple different components. In SSR, async scripts will be included in the head and prioritized behind more critical resources that block paint, such as style sheets, fonts, and image preloads. Speaking of preloads, let's talk about the preloading resources. I've heard good things about this, but I haven't actually taken a look. During initial document load and on client updates, telling the browser about resources that it will likely need to load as early as possible can have a dramatic effect on page performance. This is something that our friends over at Remix realized a while ago, and they got smart enough to start sending things like the font data you need during the initial response before they even had HTML, so the browser could start prefetching that stuff before it even starts rendering. Really handy. This is now just built into React. You can tell it to pre-initialize different scripts, preload different fonts, style sheets, even prefetch DNS. That's actually really cool. You can pre-connect to different things when you will want to request something, but you're not sure what yet. Yeah. This is cool because now when you reference these things later on, they already exist inside of the code and inside of your environment. Oh, another typo. Result should have a T here. These are the smallest typos. I can't help myself. But here we see the actual result is that these things get dumped in as prefetch and preloads automatically. These APIs can be used to make initial page loads optimized, for instance, by moving discovery of additional resources like fonts out of style sheet loading. These APIs can be used to make client updates faster, for instance, by providing and prefetching a list of resources used by an anticipated navigation, and then eagerly preloading those resources on click or even on hover. That's really cool. The idea of you might go to a page that requires another script, so as soon as you start hovering over it, we can preload. That would also work with like the play button example for the video player I was talking about earlier. Once you're hovering over the thing that needs that ability to play video, you can start preloading the JavaScript and even preload the video maybe. Cool stuff. Compatibility with third-party scripts and extensions. We've improved hydration to account for third-party scripts and browser extensions. I have actually dealt with hell with this. Since React assumes everything in the DOM is placed there correctly and by React, it breaks if you have a Chrome extension that like puts an element in a weird place. Or another fun one is if you're translating a page using like built-in browser translations, that will absolutely break React. Ideally, this will handle some of that. We've improved hydration to account for third-party scripts and browser extensions. When hydrating, if an element that renders on the client doesn't match the element found in the HTML from the server, React will force a client re-render to fix up the content. Previously, if an element was inserted by third-party scripts or browser extensions, it would trigger a mismatch error in client render. Yep. In React 19, unexpected tags in the head and body will be skipped over, avoiding the mismatch errors. If React needs to re-render the entire document due to an unrelated hydration mismatch, it will leave in place style sheets inserted by third-party scripts and browser extensions. Nice. Doesn't quite fix the problems I had, but fixes a decent chunk of them. I'm excited to see what people do with it. Better error handling. We've improved error handling in React 19 to remove duplication as well as provide options for handling caught and uncaught errors. For example, when there's an error in render caught by an error boundary, previously, React would throw the error twice, once for the original error and then once again after failing to automatically recover. And then it would call console error with the information where that occurred. This resulted in 3 errors for every caught error. Yes, it certainly did. I wonder if they're also going to fix the fact that you have to use a client component for error boundaries. We'll see as we go. But now, we log a single error with all of the information. Error hit at throws, at render, the above error occurred with the throws component, yada yada. React will try to recreate this component tree from scratch using the error boundary you provided. Additionally, we've added 2 new root options to complement on-recoverable error. They also have on-caught error, which is called when React catches an error in an error boundary. There's on-uncaught error, which is called when an error is thrown and not caught by an error boundary, as well as on-recoverable error, which is called when an error is thrown and automatically recovered. For more info and examples, you have the docs. Custom element support. Is this for web components? Yep. Custom elements are the linchpin of the web component spec. Yep, this is web components. Just wanted to confirm. Custom elements have been part of the web platform for a long while now. However, using them with React has been impractical because React has always treated unrecognized props as attributes rather than as properties. React 19 adds support for custom elements and it passes to all tests on the custom elements everywhere benchmark. During server-side rendering, props passed to a custom element will render as attributes if their type is a string, number, or the value is true. Props with type object, symbol, and function, as well as with values like false, will be omitted. During client-side rendering, props that match a property on the custom element instance will be assigned as properties, otherwise they will be assigned as attributes. Thanks to Joey for driving the design and implementation of custom elements support in React. I'm pumped that they found somebody to do this because they've wanted this for a while. I shouldn't say React wanted this, but a lot of anti-React people have wanted this. I'm not actually sure how common a case it's going to be to use this, but at the very least, it shuts up the web standards people, which if you know anything about me, you know I love making the web standards people shut up. Speaking of shutting up, I think we're done. Let me know what you think in the comments. And until next time, peace nerds.